and welcome. As Richard said, this is part of a series of 5 seminars on senior as a natural resource. The seminar series is supported by IENR Ag Research Division as part of their Big Idea seminar series. Richard mentioned those who's involved. Today's seminar, as you can read, is titled In Visual Impact, Wind Power and Community by Dr. Roopali Pahdke from Macalester College in Minnesota. Professor Pahdke's research and teaching are at the nexus of environmental studies, international development, science, and technology. Her interests lie in the democratization of science and technology, decision-making, and the hybridization of technical expertise and local knowledge. Her current research focuses on private and public development of water and energy resources. Dr. Pahdke has a bachelor's degree, BA in political science from Wellesley College, MA in South Asian Studies from Cornell, and a PhD in environmental studies from University of California, Santa Cruz. Most pertinent to her visit with us today, for the last 7 years, Roopali has been the PI on 2 connected National Science Foundation projects about wind energy and community acceptance. This research is focused on understanding the role of aesthetics and the visual politics of wind energy. This research has involved innovative methods to work with communities to consider how wind energy is compatible with current land uses. Please welcome Dr. Pahdke.
Thank you. So I know many of us are educators in the room, and I know what it's like when all the students, you know what it's like when the students sit at the back and you wish they would come just a little bit closer. So I'm wondering if I can implore you to come a little bit closer, because since we have a small group, I think it'll just be a more intimate discussion, and I won't have to project as far in the back. Oh, thank you. Let me get my clicker. So thank you so much for the invitation to join you. I feel like I've learned more about Nebraska than I have to share with you today. So it's been a terrific visit. And it's wonderful to be able to follow Jim Palmer, who was here last time. And I had a chance to listen to his presentation, and I'll try my very best not to be redundant and sort of offer you some new ideas and new perspectives. And compared with Dr. Palmer, I think I look at these questions about landscape and scenery from a very different perspective. I'm a political scientist. I think of myself as a geographer as well, and I'm really concerned with how citizens participate in decision making, and visual quality is sort of one area that I'm interested in, but I've also looked at that question of citizen and technology and decision making in some other sectors as well. And really the one important thread of my research over the last 15 years has been to try to understand how communities, when they coalesce into social movements, how and why they challenge land use practices like energy development. And really for me, I've begun to understand that as a struggle over redefining these rural energy geographies in our country. You know, they're shifting, it's dynamic, and communities all across this country and all across the world are really coming to grips with these significant shifts that are underway, particularly as we move towards a more carbon-free, if you will, kind of energy economy. So Jim Palmer ended his talk. I was listening to the presentation online. Someone asked a question about how these issues might matter for Nebraska, and he ended by saying, well, it's really important to inventory your visual resources. And so in a way, I'm going to try to start where he left off, and talk about the ways in which you try to identify and inventory the places that you may want to protect. So with that, what I'm going to do today is put that all in the context of the work that we've been doing on wind energy. So I'm going to just start with some just very brief, some numbers and some context about wind energy in the US and in Nebraska, and you're probably much more versed in that than I am, the Nebraska piece. Describe these 2 connected research projects that we've been working on for the last 7 years. And by we, I work with a team of undergraduates who are fantastic research assistants, and then some other faculty colleagues from a variety of disciplines. Talk about this landscape symposium methodology that we've been developing over the last few years, and kind of share with you some case studies from our work, and then try to draw out what are some preliminary conclusions from this still very much ongoing research project. Okay, so I study public opinion, and I study public opinion and public acceptance of wind energy at that community level. And one of the areas that I've been focused on in the last probably 5 to 7 years is drawing attention to why local communities around the United States are opposing wind energy, and why that pace of opposition is just growing at such an interesting and alarming clip all over the United States. And some classify that as NIMBYism, not in my backyard. It's the rich elite who want to preserve their views. The Cape Wind example from Massachusetts is often brought up. And I really want to complexify that. I want to offer an argument that concerns about wind energy as they come up across the country are often very much concerns about the changing character of rural landscapes. They're over a sense of disenfranchisement from the planning process and planning decision making. And frankly, it's often a response to what I would argue is the misconduct of developers, who from a great distance cite projects really with little concern for how this new technology affects the livelihoods and the landscapes of people who live on them and with them every day. So the most recent work that we've been doing is, we've acknowledged that all this controversy exists, and we've been trying to ask, how do you get ahead of that? How do you get upstream of all these conflicts and really think about how you engage communities in these very big land use decisions? So I'm going to try to talk about that research today and draw from some of the case studies that we've been developing. So to begin with, just for some context, wind power in the United States, I just want to remind us of where Nebraska is, and this is probably a little dated. I think you're probably closer to 330 megawatts or something like that. But what's important is to see it relative to some of these numbers. Texas is the leader, California is second, and then Minnesota and Iowa, and kind of these western states are in a little bit of a juggling match over who's number 3. I'm from Minnesota, and wind turbines have been on the landscape in Minnesota now for 15 to 20 years. And I think in many ways, the states that are leading the charge have had some really interesting discussions about how we come to live with this new technology, maybe longer than people in other parts of the country. So this is a picture of where wind is installed right now in the United States. But this might be the more important one. So the Department of Energy has a stated goal that by 2030, there's a hope that 20% of electricity will be from wind power. And I want to acknowledge what a gigantic challenge meeting that standard is. So if this is where Nebraska is now, and I believe there's many projects that are under construction right now and many more that are pending, but according to the National Renewable Energy Lab, the part of the Department of Energy that works on these issues, the potential is to add almost 8,000 megawatts of wind over the next 20 years. So that's an enormous leap, right? And it's one that would have fundamental effects on the landscapes that we know. Whether this is achievable is a whole other discussion, but it's the target that's been set, and so it's really worth thinking through what that means. So this map here shows how these targets are different. The darkest green, so these are states that by 2030 the hope is that they would have greater than 20 gigawatts or 20,000 megawatts of wind energy. So that's Oklahoma, Texas, interestingly Michigan, and then Nebraska is in this lighter green here along with us here in Minnesota. So that's just some context for the work that we've been doing. And some of you may be familiar with this. This is really for my benefit as I try to better understand what's going on here in Nebraska. This is a wind resource map where the darkest blue is the areas of highest wind resource. And this map below shows you in blue the counties that have wind projects, and interestingly in green where the wind energy manufacturing facilities are. So what I like to map on or superimpose is where the highest wind resources are and where those counties are. And I don't know, but it may be that there's not a lot of transmission in these areas, so perhaps that's why the projects aren't in there, and they are where they are. So on to our research. So as I said, we've had these 2 connected projects that have been funded by the National Science Foundation over the last 7 years. I'm going to start with the first one very briefly and then move to the second. So the big question I was asking in this first project is why and how are communities actually contesting wind projects? When we started this research 7 years ago, there wasn't a lot of information about this, and I think we've really helped develop some of these case studies. And what we did was develop case studies from across the country of contested wind projects and really tried to understand how much of that contestation was about the visual. Right? Okay, it might have been about wildlife and it might have been about other things, but in the end, weren't these all really defined or framed by aesthetic considerations? So let me just share a little bit of that work going on here. So one of the things I was trying to understand is how this, I'm calling it anti-wind for lack of a better phrase, movement evolved, where it lives, what does it mean for wind energy. And so what we did is, over a series of years, really do research on where there were organizations across this country that were opposing wind energy development and try to make sense of that. What kinds of organizations were these? Were they long established groups? Were they ones that just arose around a controversial project? How were they networked? How do they share information with one another? And so just a couple of interesting things to point. There are over 200 organizations on this map, and this was done a couple years ago, and I need to render this again, and I would be adding probably at least another 20 or 30 to this now. But what you'll note is, this movement is densest in New England, where actually there is far little installed wind energy. So you could ask, is that a cause and effect relationship? It's interesting to think about. There is also a presence in the upper Midwest of these oppositional groups, and definitely growing in the West and in the Intermountain West. So if I showed you, and I wish I had thought to bring with me this map from 2007, and over time you can see how this movement is spreading. So I've been interested in how this movement has been spreading. And what's interesting to me is that these organizations, if you dig down deep into their rhetoric, into their websites and all of that, you see really a lot of shared language, a common vocabulary, a common strategy for sort of having these campaigns. And so here's a list of some of these organizations that we've been studying over the years. And it doesn't take long to see what they have in common. If you look across them, you see a lot of framing as groups about the preservation of something or the saving of something or the protecting of something. These are just the save ones. I have a whole other list of the ones that start with, protect this place or preserve that place, such as protect Pendleton, protect the Flint Hills, the Ridge Protectors of Vermont. These are some of the slogans that you'll see across rural America where projects are being contested. This, I think, is one of my favorites, but there's a lot more that could be up here. So as we look across these hundreds of groups and say, what is it that they share in common? Well, it's often about the character of the places that they're trying to protect. So a lot of it goes back to aesthetics and to the visual landscape. But also wildlife concerns are really important. And these other issues which are tied to aesthetics, like noise, are these noisy? Does it impact the way we find peace in the landscape? And so lots of common issues come up. But here's one way to think about the factors that are impacting people's public perceptions of wind energy. And some of it is physical. So, the scale of the towers, how they look, the acoustics, the proximity from a wind farm to other settlements or houses. Some of it is political, so it's the process by which these projects are developed. Were communities able to participate or not? And that really colors perception heavily. Some of it is socioeconomic. Are people sharing in the benefits? Are they sharing in the benefits in a way that seems just or fair? Some public perceptions are really driven just by the representation. Many people see wind turbines as signs of progress, and they're affirming of a clean energy future. Others see them as blights. In our transcripts, we have terms like machetes in the sky, bird Cuisinarts, all kinds of things which are really different than symbols of progress, right? So there's just a whole spectrum of representational views on this. And then one of the things I want to talk about today is the place issues, the place politics that get evoked when a large wind farm is built. And then lastly, on the personal, our perception of these technologies is in fact driven by if we have any experience with them. Have we seen them in other places? Did we grow up with them? I've had many people recount to me that they feel really positively about wind energy because they've spent time in Denmark or in the Netherlands or in Germany where they've been on the landscape for a long time, and to them it seemed very compatible with those land uses. So that prior knowledge and prior experience is important. So as part of our research, we developed case studies from around the country, and these are on our project website. And one of my goals was to develop them as teaching tools. So there are long case studies, and then there are some that are just 2 pages, which are meant to really draw out comparisons across these sites. So I invite you to use them in your classrooms. But we looked at all of these different projects. Some of them we did field work at, some of them we did interviews and did kind of a little bit less of a deep investigation. But really, we wanted to understand what was going on, why people were opposing, and what the impact of that opposition was on the actual development of these places. So moving on, our second project was quite different. It was again trying to get ahead of this controversy and ask, well, what kinds of projects will communities support? Right? We know that they've contested the ones that have been delivered to them. Well, what kinds of ones would they support? Or put in a different way, what kinds of communities support wind projects? And so that's what we've been investigating for the last 3 years. And the goal here was to try to experiment with some different models for deliberative dialogue, where we would have participants try to rank those landscape preferences in the course of their deliberations, suggest the kinds of wind projects that they would be likely to support in terms of scale, size, and mitigation. So that's what we've been working on. And I want to share with you some of the big research questions, the theoretical ones, and also some of the really site-specific ones that we've been asking. So on this theoretical level, I'm curious about when the best moments are, the best, as I call them, upstream moments to do this kind of work. Sometimes it's too late when there's already a really controversial project pending. You missed that window. If we could have done this 2 years ago, we could have really changed the course of that community's politics. So when is the best moment to engage in this kind of deliberative work? We're also asking about the kinds of spaces and the kinds of facilitation efforts that really nurture this kind of inclusive dialogue that we want to have around energy, technology, and place. And then lastly, this, which is very much a public policy question, is if you do 1 and 2, do you actually create useful knowledge that's policy relevant that can help developers and government officials plan projects better? So those are the questions that we're asking. On a local level, I want to give, in the communities that we work, our participants a chance to tell us and to tell their communities what are their main concerns, about these impacts from a livelihood level and also from a sort of landscape, scenic and aesthetic level. We want to know whether those concerns are the experience of living with these technologies, or is it the imagination around these technologies? Where are those hopes and fears coming from? And again, if there's certain ways to do this development that might be more favorable or acceptable than others. So we began this work with a pilot project in Laramie, Wyoming a number of years ago, and we did it just on a little shoestring budget. We did it in cooperation with 2 conservation districts in Carbon County and Laramie County, Wyoming, and also my third partner, well, with 2 other partners. One was the University of Wyoming, which provided a really interesting facilitation role, and then with this NGO called Scenic America. So we brought our resources together to do this pilot project, and we had a full 9 to 10 hour day where we invited participants to think with us and to have these long discussions. We included some keypad polling software technologies. Are you guys familiar with keypad polls? They kind of look like little remote controls where you can do interactive real-time polling. So we used some of those technologies. We used photo simulations. We also had some guided tours of current and planned facilities, and really tried to engage our participants in thinking about how wind energy was going to transform, and has transformed, the landscapes in these 2 counties. So we had, surprisingly to us, we had hoped to just get 20 or 30 people. We capped it at 60. I think we had 100 who wanted to participate, and we couldn't scale up our model big enough for the numbers who wanted to participate. And so these are some images from our event. We had some presentations similar to what Dr. Palmer did, talking about, well, what is visual quality? What are scenic resources? We also did some polling about what our participants thought were the benefits of wind energy. And so for this group, they told us that energy independence was, in their opinion, the biggest benefit. We also asked them what their concerns were. And in this group, scenic impacts and wildlife impacts, which I will argue are coupled concerns, ranked the highest. Here. We also did a lot of different kinds of visualization exercises. So we took pre and post turbine landscapes and asked our participants to give us keywords. And then we analyzed those keywords. We did sort of a simplistic linguistic analysis, also developed some word clouds to sort of see which words were really used in common by the group. So this is our before shot, and I just want to point to this and this on the image as reference. Right, and then this is our after. And this is actually the photograph, and this is a reverse simulation. Right, so we asked them about images like this, which really gives you a sense of scale on the landscape. And then we had a lot of really deep discussions with people about their landscape values. I have one more image from this that I think you'll find interesting, which is I commissioned a photographer who took thousands of images of wind turbines on the landscape. And then we had a whole wall of photographs. And we asked participants to look at these images, realizing that they're flat, they're two-dimensional, that there's lots of problems with this sort of exercise. But, we said just give us a top-of-the-mind reading on which of these images you think is most compatible with the landscape. And what really surprised us was that overwhelmingly they found this project to be the most visually, or least visually impactful image, whereas this one was of huge concern. And so we got a chance to, through the data we collected, try to explain why. And so, and this is a very diverse landscape. You have a lot going on in the foreground and in the background, and so it helps minimize the impact of those turbines on this sort of middle ridge here, right? Whereas on this sort of grassland image, we had our participants tell us that it reminded them of grave markers. We had all kinds of descriptions of what this meant. It meant disruption of wildlife patterns, right? They felt like it looked like a fence. So whereas we thought, oh, this would most likely be the landscape that was compatible, we actually found otherwise. We also had participants who were both who lived closer to Laramie and those who lived further outside of Laramie. And a very interesting discussion came up about whether wind turbines, and in this community it's not this size farms, but some of the smaller ones, 10, 20 turbines, do they belong closer to town or do they belong in these more remote areas? And this group of participants told us they belong closer to town, because it's in these places where we go to recreate, where we don't want to see the turbines, because these are really important, and some people use language like sacred places to us. But in our daily lived experience, we can live with these technologies. And those kinds of insights were dramatically different region by region that we found in our research. So with that data, we went back to the National Science Foundation and got another grant to take and develop this model and apply it more widely across, in our case, is mostly the northern United States. And so we've developed this model, we call it the Landscape Symposium, and we kind of go through a series of steps to launch these projects to get a sense of what public opinion is around place value, landscape value, and wind energy. And so we've done this now several times, and we're kind of in the midst of this comparative research. But what we do is we work with the local committee to try to do some initial surveys, to collect some initial data about what's going on in the communities that we're working in. And then we look at census data, and we try to recruit a representative sample of local citizens. And it's a really tricky job. This is what we learned from our experience in Wyoming. We just invited people to come, and there was not enough diversity in our pool, right? So for me, that really called into question some of our findings. So in all the subsequent work that we've done, we've worked very carefully to look at the census data and to recruit as close to a representative sample as we can. I'll show you what that means in some of our other cases. We also pay participants for their time, and the National Science Foundation has generously provided us with that money to do so that we honor the time people commit to this work. It also helps broaden the socioeconomic background of people who are willing to participate. We produce a wind energy primer that we send to them so that they're all hopefully working off the same base information. And then when we invite them to come to our symposia, we do a lot of pre and post event data collection to try to understand what the effect of spending a day together means. And then we have developed a series of discussion exercises and visualization exercises. So we've done these symposia over the last year and a half in 3 different states, 3 very different communities, but our process, our methodology has been absolutely consistent. We've really done the same kinds of discussion exercises and collected the same kind of data. So we could ask, is there in fact a sort of regional view on what wind energy should look like? And so I'm going to share some of that research with you. I'm going to draw from a case study from Michigan, and I very much realized that Nebraska looks nothing like Michigan, but what I wanted to share with you is the method that we use. So it's less about the pictures and more of the way we went about doing this research. Just for some more context, we were working in Manistee and in Benzie County, which is this area here. And in Michigan, a lot of the wind energy resources are right along the coast. So really important issues for tourism and for these communities. So this is what's going on in these communities. You see lots of anti-wind signs and lots of pro-wind signs. Very tense issue in this region, including billboards like this that say, "Enjoy the view this summer, it may be our last chance." So our work in Michigan was done in collaboration with an effort called Understanding Wind, the Understanding Wind Initiative. So our research team worked as consultants to 6 townships. So that's who contracted with us to collect data about public concerns. And we did some pretty, I think, exhaustive research for these townships. We did some community surveys. That was the first stage. We responded to questions that were generated in town hall meetings that were held over a period of 6 months. And then we also had a landscape symposium. So I'm just really briefly touch on the findings from each of these. And very importantly, our research team then went back several months later and reported back on all of these findings and tried to help local citizens make sense of the research that we'd done. So in terms of our community survey, we sent out thousands of these. Every property owner got a survey in the mail. We had a response rate of 20%, which is good for survey work. In terms of our demographics, interestingly, 60% of our respondents were male. Usually, if any of you do survey research, it's usually the other way around, which I think is indicative of this particular issue of wind energy. And mean age was 62, which is also relatively high for survey response rates. And then this is interesting. We had 28% of the respondents say that they were seasonal residents.
Can I ask you about that 1% discrepancy in the gender? Is that where they simply did not indicate
Yeah.
gender?
Yeah. So the seasonal residency status is really important in this region and maybe less important here. I'm not sure, but the research has documented that full-time residents and seasonal residents approach landscapes very differently, and they approach wind energy on the landscape really differently. So this is an opportunity to drill down and understand what the difference was. And so this is some of the data. When we asked them, do you support wind? In these townships, we had 40.8% say no, and we had 36% say yes, right? So pretty split down the middle. What's interesting is for those who oppose, you can oppose, but just check off that I strongly oppose. It suggests an emotional intensity, right, to your decision. And so we have 30% checking that box off. So the emotions were really high around this issue. On the full-time versus seasonal, we had 33% of seasonal residents tell us they oppose, and only 13% tell us they support. And this is a statistically significant difference in our sample size. Okay, so it did suggest to us that seasonal residents really thought about wind energy on the landscape really differently than full-time residents. And it could be because those full-time residents may have had the opportunity to get some income from their wind energy on their farm, whereas for seasonal residents, it was really a detraction from their experience. That this was a place they went to get away from it all, and the wind turbines took away from that experience. These are some of the surveys that we sent out in the mail, and so we were asking all kinds of questions using a Likert scale. You know, how do you think they'll affect your local scenic beauty? What do you think the effects on local tourism will be, on property values, on the appearance of the night sky, which is a really big issue in rural communities. And so we were collecting data not just at that top level, do you support or do you oppose, but specifically what are your concerns? So this is what we learned in terms of negative impacts. Local scenic beauty was right up there for these folks in terms of their concerns. In terms of the positive issues, like in our Wyoming group, the idea of producing clean energy was one of the main reasons for doing it. It wasn't creating new jobs, which is what a lot of the rhetoric has been about. We also asked about the I don't knows, right? So what issues do you not feel like you can answer, you don't know enough about? And this was interesting to us because these are the issues that people said, the percentages of people who said, I don't know, I have no idea what the effect on my electricity is going to be, or I have no idea if this is really going to impact climate change. On this end, there was the most certainty. So 97% of people felt like they knew what the effects on the scenic landscape were going to be. Well, I would venture to say that they don't know because nobody in this region knows the turbines aren't up yet. But there was a confidence among the public that they knew what their landscape was going to look like, and either they didn't like it or they liked it. I'm going to zip through some of these other slides. We also had these 3 town hall meetings where questions were collected, and then our job was to help provide some expertise in answer to those questions. Really broad questions like, I want to know what the environmental impact of all of these technologies are, which would have been at least 3 volumes of research, to the very specific questions like, I want to know what percentage of people living within 150 feet of a large turbine don't sleep at night. So this is kind of the range of questions that are out there among the public. And then, knowledge gaps, like questions about, what right does our town have to make these decisions? And then questions about, which I would call social and procedural justice. Are landowners being fairly compensated for hosting these turbines? So there was so many questions, over 400 of them that we recorded that people wanted to know answers to. And then getting around to the symposia that we held, we were trying to assemble 22 people for this intensive dialogue, looking at census targets. This is what we were aiming for, and this is what we got. So we were also trying to diversify their stance on wind energy. And I just wanted to point to this, right? 68% of our participants were between the ages of 50 and 64. And this has been standard across the symposia that we've done around the country, that it's been incredibly difficult to engage young people, particularly that 29 and under group. And we have tried all different ways of trying to get them to apply and get them to come, but we have routinely found that men between the ages of 50 and 65 really want to engage in this dialogue, and everybody else, we have to pull their teeth to get involved. So there's something there that I want to dig deeper into, but I won't go into it further here. So again, discussions about challenges and opportunities. We've been doing a mapping exercise where we create satellite images of these communities, and we ask our participants to identify the places that are really significant to them and why. And then so we have focus groups. We had 3 different focus groups, blue, yellow, and red. And then we try to then converge that data and see if there are particular places that our participants spoke of that they had common value around. And that indicates to us that these are likely the places where if you were going to build a wind energy project that you would have the most contestation. So it helps identify sites that maybe should be avoided in the future, and others where there seems to be little concern. And then we also worked through a series of simulations. Again, I realize that this landscape is quite different than yours, and can someone hit the lights for me? Because I think these images will look clearer if we can turn the lights down. I think right behind there. Oh, really?
That helps right there.
Can we get to, is that okay? Well, we only have up or down. Okay, well, it's really hard to see them with the lights on. Well, you see them here. And we were simulating at a viewing distance of 3 miles, and these are 2 megawatt units. And we were doing it on different landscapes and trying to register how the sense of compatibility changed as we looked at different landscapes. And here's another one. And we were also mixing up the scale and the configuration. So 3 versus 6 versus 12. And so these are sort of receding on the horizon. So you can imagine 500 feet or a mile distance that they're stacked. And we were asking our participants to tell us, did this place change for you if there was 3 or 6 or 12, and why? And among these diverse landscapes, are there ones that are most compatible with wind energy? We also went through an exercise where we talked about trade-offs and we talk about scale. So, you have a small project and it increases in scale, and also that your return to community is different at different scales. And we ask our participants, which of these would you be likely to support and why? So it really does generate a good discussion about trade-offs. Is it important to you how much renewable energy is generated? And if that's your major concern, then do you want to go with a larger scale project? Or what's the cost to that in terms of scenic beauty? So we're trying to sort of catalyze these conversations. And at the end of the day, we try to come to some consensus around the best practice principles that can help guide local officials as they think about ordinances at the county or the town level. And so some of the things that this particular group in Michigan, in addition to talking about scale and place, a lot of concern for independent studies, for a good public process, for thinking about thresholds. Is there a certain scale of project beyond which it fundamentally changes the character of this place, and that we need to really think about what that threshold is? And if we have 10 turbines here and 10 turbines here and 10 turbines there, is that worse than having 30 here? So those were the kind of conversations we were trying to catalyze. We were also trying to understand what the effects of deliberation were. And so we asked our participants what they thought of wind energy in the United States before we began our event and after. And so there's a sort of interesting shift here, where here only 24% said that they had reservations but would cautiously support, and 19% said that they strongly supported, and that grew to 76% at the end of the day. That's a pretty big difference. However, far less shift when you ask them, what about in your town? And this very much maps onto the scholarship that references the social gap in wind energy public perception, where in the abstract, 88% of Americans will say they support wind energy, but when you ask them about in their community, that support precipitously drops, and that's what was demonstrated here. This is similar data from an event we did in Minnesota where we did the exact same process, where at the end of the day we had, over 80% saying that they supported wind energy, but still, different when you ask them about in their community. It still grew from the morning and the afternoon, but it still wasn't as significant as this. So I'm going to start to conclude so we have time for questions. We have reports from all of these different symposia that we've held in different parts of the country. We have a 4th one that's going to be available in about a week's time, and they're up on our project website. I'm happy to share them with you. I have some copies with me today if you'd like to kind of understand our process and our findings in more detail. But let me end with some conclusions about this question about, is wind energy compatible with the landscape, and is it desirable? And these are some of the some of the analysis that we're doing as we're now trying to compare the data that we've collected across the country. And let me begin with this question about the relationship between population density and topography. And conventionally, the conventional understanding is that wind opposition, or communities oppose wind because as you get closer to population centers, wind gets more controversial. So as if it's a simple effect that avoid going where people are, because if you go to places where people live, they're not going to support wind energy. So we're trying to complicate that understanding and say, what is it about the relationship between population density and topography that either makes communities support or oppose? And it's not very simple, because in fact there are places in the United States, and even in our case studies, where there were communities and they were densely populated calculated and said, we'd rather have them closer to where we live rather than far out there. And so we found that in our case studies. And we also found that it's far less about population density than it is the social capital and the culture of those communities and how they think about the trade-offs. So for example, in our Minnesota group, there was a lot of discussion about, well, if we say no to these, then what does this mean for other people? Aren't these turbines going to go somewhere else? And what about global warming? What about mountaintop removal? It sort of extended into lots of other discussions. So it's not simply a response to population density. We're also looking at this role of siting, of regulation, and of energy standards. So again, the conventional understanding is states that have renewable energy standards or portfolio standards that incentivize wind development, that's where the wind industry is going to go. However, those are also the places where local opposition is really strong because it's a very top-down mandate. So, the state of Massachusetts or Minnesota says X percentage of wind energy should be developed, and then those communities are targeted for that development. So that these standards often create this loss of local control or loss of local authority. So that creates opposition. We're also really trying to understand place attachment and what I've been thinking about as place memory. And this is a complex issue because it really means asking, why do people live where they live, right? And why do they live where they live? What's the sense of place or attachment to place that comes out? And how is that connected to the physical qualities of the place, the scenery, if you will? And how much of it is connected to the memory of the place? So it's an imagined place that people are holding on to. And I want to talk about this because it's both collective, like we think of this place in this way, and it's individual. And this gets really complicated because we have our participants who talk about why they oppose wind energy, and they say, it's because I want to protect the pristine nature of my community or my county. Well, in fact, forests have been felled, the land has been mined, there's been agriculture for 100 years. These are not pristine places, but they're imagined as being pristine. And so there's something about the way we remember or the way our memories get stacked, or there's generations of land use that are forgotten that make these places pristine. And so people want to protect the pristine quality of that nature when, in fact, it's second growth, third generation land use change. So we're trying to really understand what that memory means and why is it that we want to hold landscapes static when they're continuously dynamic. And the last thing I'll mention is looking across our case studies, we're trying to understand how we're seeing shifts in rural communities, rural geographies, from a sort of productive landscape to a consumptive use of landscape. And let me say a little bit more about that. And I think it's probably the case in Nebraska as well, that rural populations are dramatically changing. They're not the same as they were 50 years ago. And in many places, a historical sense of extractive or industrial land use is now giving way to very new kinds of what are considered consumptive landscape uses, recreation being one of those. And landscapes that are thought of as recreational landscapes, that are consumed with binocular in hand, it seems that they're rather incompatible with wind energy, which is considered an extractive landscape use. So being able to place a community at this point in its history on a sort of productive, consumptive spectrum, I think helps predict the compatibility of wind energy in that place. That's certainly borne out in the communities that we've studied. And it's complex, and it really means sitting down and talking to people for a long time to understand how they view their landscape. So I wanted to end at 4:45, so I'm pretty close to that. I'm happy to take your questions. This reminded me of something I might see out here, so I wanted to throw that picture in. This is from Clay County in western Minnesota, but I also wanted to just acknowledge those who've worked with me and the wonderful funding that we've received for this project over the last few years. Let me stop there, and I welcome your questions on our research.
Second, here. You can hand it for the job.
I'm just curious as to what it is about the symposium that ended up changing the attitudes of people.
So that's a great question. The very nature of having to sit down and spend 10 hours with people that you don't know and have to, in fact, be captive to listening to their ideas presents all this new information. And so one of the questions that we ask in our end of the day evaluations is, did you learn something new today? Did you have a better understanding of the difficult choices that are before your planners? And so we run through these sorts of questions, and I think in the process of that, people change their minds. They came in thinking one thing, and through the process of dialogue, they come out somewhere else. So it is that deliberation that happens.
So it was the dialogue among all the
Yeah.
participants?
Yeah. And of course, if you remember my slide, they are coming in with very different backgrounds. They're across the income spectrum, gender. We also look at educational status when we select that pool of participants. And so they just have very different takes on these issues. And so it may be that in our daily life, we kind of just talk to the same people. And we sort of just spin our webs and we share the same information. And it's rare that we're sitting, that I'm a 65-year-old man and I'm sitting across from an 18-year-old woman and she's telling me why she thinks wind energy is so important. And those dialogue, we're creating those dialogues. Yeah.
In your analysis where you were doing the simulations of a mountain in the background and you said, were you comparing the landscapes against each other, or were you showing it with and without the wind turbines?
So you can tell me which slide you're thinking of.
The one where you said they looked like gravestones.
Yeah. I'm getting there. There we go. So your question was, what are we comparing?
Are you asking them to just look at these pictures with the turbines on them and say
Yeah.
which landscapes do you think are most disruptive, or are you showing them pictures with and without the turbines in the same scene?
Right. So what we were showing them were, I think there was a series of 10 to 12 images that all had similar scale projects of similar density. So they were all wind projects that existed on the Wyoming landscape. So that it's in Wyoming, wind energy has already been built on many different kinds of landscapes. So those projects are out there and they exist. And so we were saying, across this diversity of projects, which did you think is the most compatible? The compatibility between the landscape type and the wind project. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at this from, like the previous speaker was talking about, you're only concerned about significant landscape resources. Well, the bottom one wouldn't be a significant resource where the top one might be in their main study, for instance.
Right.
And so, you, as a planner, you want to put them in that lesser impacted land or lesser quality landscape.
Right, exactly. And that's what we were thinking too. But that sense of quality, our participants told us their sense of quality was very different. That they found these to be high quality landscapes for different reasons. And particularly because this was a group that really cared a lot about wildlife. And for them, this was a sage grouse landscape. It was all of these qualifiers that they used. And they were as concerned about impact on this landscape as on one which we would think would be a more prized landscape for its scenic beauty and for its diversity. I think there was someone over on this. Yeah.
Just follow up to that. Do you think, when I look at those two, part of my response to the top one is the fact that a lot of those turbines are in shade and there's not as much contrast?
Right.
So
Yeah.
did you control for any of, also just the literal distance? I think you mentioned 3 miles distance in terms of what you had stipulated as. So was there a specific reason to come up with that particular distance? And when you showed all these different and got the responses, was that also part of what you were looking for? Or at least you acknowledged that may have happened?
We certainly acknowledge the imperfections in this kind of an activity. It's two-dimensional. This project is going to look different if you're standing on this side or this side. And so, that's certainly the case. But what we were we were trying, and again, it was a top of the mind kind of exercise, your gut instinct, which of these seems compatible with the kind of wind energy that's being developed. So the shading issue, it's a really good point. Part of our constraint was we had a photographer out there. These are not simulations. We had a photographer out there taking pictures of wind on the landscape. And, it would probably be, I know Jim Palmer talks about responsible simulations, and it's true, it would probably be more responsible if these were all simulations so that you could control the shading effect. This was done during our pilot project, and we had resources to send the photographer out there. We didn't have the resources to hire the simulators to then go back in and control for all of these effects. So I think you're right. I think the shading is an issue. But what was more striking to me about the shading was our participants saying, and this is called, I think it's Elkhorn Mountain. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this part of Wyoming, but they said this is a really special place to us, and we don't feel like the view of the mountain is obscured by the turbines. So it might have been very, it's highly unlikely, but if they were on the top there, their view might have been very different.
Is it a matter of scale? Because in the one landscape, the scale for matches, blends in with the mountains, and on the other, the scale is dramatically different.
Yeah, I think there is a scalar effect. And this is also a view that you would see from a highway. Right? And it's a highway that a lot of people travel on. So it wasn't just whether it was a remote view or was it an everyday view. And that's what people were expressing to us. They drive on this highway, they see these projects, and they're more concerned to them, whereas they don't get this view until they go up on that hike and they go to that ridge and they see this place. And so that was a part of the discussion too, is the familiarity of the view, how frequent it was, how many people are likely to see this versus see that. And so it was certainly complicated. Let me just, to the question about control, when we did these simulations in Michigan, and as we've done them in other landscape symposia, we've been trying to control for the things that you said, try to really pay attention to keeping viewing distance and shadowing and all of that consistent so that they're commenting on the landscape and not the turbines, that the turbines are consistently represented across the simulations.
Was that Tom Lottie in one of those photos from
Yeah, it was.
BLM? The
Yeah.
BLM is in constant argument with the FAA on whether they can change that white out, because that's such a huge contrast issue for the visual. FAA says it has to be white because so airplanes can see them before they run into them. But on the night issue with the lighting you mentioned in terms of the night skies, there's issues of why can't we have the warning lights come on prior to an airplane running into one if it gets close enough to do that, and then let's use the change to mute the color on these because it's such a huge contrast.
Right, and I believe the FAA has given way on some issues with nighttime lighting because they're allowing the perimeter of the wind farm to be lit and not every single unit, which has a dramatic effect on the night sky.
As I understand it, those are strobe lights?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's for bird attack protection.
That's other questions. These are great questions.
With all of the case studies you've done, do you think you're going to be able to come up with a good decision support tool or something, a model that can be used? Because obviously very diverse results in every community.
Exactly. So we're at the phase of our work now where we could literally run around the country doing these everywhere, and there's a lot of interest in them, and I think we have some additional support, but that kind of for me loses sight of what we're trying to do. So yes, these communities are very different, and we could do 20 more of these and the results would be different because every region is significantly different, even within a state. So really what we're trying to do is extract some of the lessons that we've learned from these, and so not so much focus on what's different, but focus on what's the same, right? So when we have this process and we ask people at the end of the day to come up with best principles, best siting principles, it's amazing that you assemble these hugely different groups and they come out with the same thing. And a lot of it is procedural and process oriented. And so we can comment on the things that we find in the same across these. So we're trying to focus on that. But also, as part of our commitment to the National Science Foundation, we've been asked to write a community guide, which is a protocol or a handbook or a manual on this approach. So again, the idea there isn't that it can be perfectly followed in every context, but that at least we can record the experiences that we've had and the benefits of choosing one approach over the other. And one of the biggest challenges in our work is recruiting a representative sample. And it's difficult no matter what the topic is. And so what we want to share is the experiences that we've had and how to do that responsibly, who you need to ask, how you need to think about how you reach all of these different populations. For me, it's paramount that young people are part of these conversations, because these are the landscapes that they're going to inherit. And also, they think about wind energy dramatically differently than their parents and their grandparents. So if they're not franchised in these discussions, it's a huge problem. So, it's recruiting the right people, making sure they're at the table, giving them the right incentives to be involved, creating facilitation tools so that people listen, or you encourage them to listen even if they're not hearing. So, that's what we're trying to do when we try to document the process that we've developed.
I made a short film last year about a smaller wind farm in Petersburg, Nebraska. It's up in the northeast part of the state. And one of the interesting things about that community is that it was largely organized by the people who lived there. They were the ones who sort of generated the push to get the wind farm in the community, which it's not always that way in Nebraska. And one of the people that I spoke with was the owner of the local hardware store. There's only one in town. And he was adamantly opposed to this wind farm in the very beginning. And he told me something very interesting the day I went and talked to him, which was that he went online before the farm was actually there and searched for everything negative that he could find about wind farms, not knowing anything about them. So I'm just kind of wondering, in your research, either anecdotally or empirically, have you run into the influence of the internet on pro or con for wind?
Yeah, it's huge, and it's one of the hardest things to control for. So, I said that we try to bring this representative sample together. We try to provide them with a dossier, which we painstakingly vet in terms of the information that's in there. But you have no idea where that takes people and which sites that they go to, whose testimonial, and how that colors the information that they come with. And it's a really interesting challenge. So there's a lot of information. There's a lot of good information. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of testimonial on the internet right now about the way they sound, about the way they look, and those are very hard to authenticate. That kind of evidence is so subjective, and it's very difficult to trust. So it's a huge issue, and I don't want to sidestep that. Nonetheless, what's been the most interesting thing to see across these symposia is that you have people that are pro and you have people that are against, and you have people in the middle. One of the things that we've noticed is if one of those sides is, if it's out of balance, right? So, for example, in one of our symposia, this is one we did in Massachusetts, we tried our best to create a representative sample. What we didn't know is that the people who were opposed were an organized force, and the people who supported, but they were individuals. And so the people who opposed, they shared a vocabulary, they shared a rhetoric, they kept using the same numbers, and so they had more influence in a way, even though in sheer numbers they were equal, because the individuals who told us that they supported wind energy, they did so on an individual level, with all the caveats that we have as individuals, and they weren't organized, so they weren't saying the same things together in one voice, and so their influence was different. I don't know if I'm making myself clear or not. This is one of the hardest things that we found with these citizen juries or representative samples, is you can aim for balance, but there are all these things that you don't know about these communities. And it's not that these individuals necessarily plan to be there together, but because of the way that the anti-wind organizations work, they have this dense network, and they communicate very well. And frankly, this is the case all over the country, that the pro-wind organizing groups are not nearly as sophisticated or networked as the anti-wind ones are. So the effect of the internet, of the testimonials, of the films, all of that, there isn't a countervailing force. And so that's one of the challenges. I know I'm not being abundantly clear here, but it's one of the things that we struggle with information, frankly. And so we try to have expert panels. But those are fraught too, because there's a million different kinds of experts that one can have, and they're vulnerable as well.
Got time for one more question, Steve. So I hope you had a chance to ask you. So
You mentioned the trade-offs.
Mm.
Did you come across issues like eminent domain or public use, private property?
Yes, yes, we did. And in the case of Minnesota, it's one of the first instances that I know of where a city has tried to use the power of eminent domain to build a wind farm project. So in our work in Minnesota, people are worried about eminent domain because there's a precedent for it. It was unsuccessful. So the city tried to use their eminent domain powers to build a wind farm. The State Public Utilities Commission squashed that effort. So it didn't succeed. But so there is this fear that our land will be taken from us, that in Minnesota, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with our late Senator Paul Wellstone, but is that a name that means something, Paul Wellstone? So Paul Wellstone was famous because he wrote about the rebellion against the electricity lines, transmission lines in Minnesota, which was this fear over eminent domain. So in that state, that fear runs very deep. And so there is this concern that if we don't step in, if we don't make a stand, if we don't do this right, then we're going to lose the power to decide. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you meant by eminent domain, but it is a big issue right now. And it's even more an issue on transmission lines than it is about the wind power projects themselves.
well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut it off at that point, but thank you, Roopali. This
You're
This has
welcome.
been great. One of the things, if I could just editorialize for a second, sitting here watching this, and I consider myself probably a little further ahead than most Nebraskans in understanding this, I'm shocked at how far behind the curve we are. If we're going to get some of these issues that you've talked about at least out in the public, I think that we've got a lot of work to do. So thank you very
You're
much.
welcome.
For coming
Thank
and
you for
sharing
your
this with us
questions.
today.